Since the beginning of the 2022 Russo-Ukrainian War, Russia lost a lot of equipment. In this video, we listed the top 10 worst Russian equipment lost in Ukraine so far. Enjoy! Number 10 is the Mi-24. The Mi-24 is one of the most widely known attack helicopters in the world. The core of the aircraft was derived from the Mi-8. Mi-24 is popularly described as a flying tank because its fuselage body is heavily armored and can resist impacts from 12.7mm rounds from all angles. The titanium rotor blades are also resistant to 12.7mm rounds, but its tail is extremely vulnerable due to the lack of armor in that section. Older versions of the Mi-24 suffer from a design flaw in the configuration of their engines that makes them highly vulnerable to the manpads. The Mi-24 has its engines placed in an inline configuration in an attempt to streamline the helicopter to increase speed and minimize the aircraft's overall frontal profile to incoming fire in a head-on attack. However, this has the opposite effect of leaking all the exhaust gases from the Mi-24's engines directly out the sides of the aircraft and away from the helicopter's rotor wash, creating two massive sources of heat and ultraviolet radiation. Before the war, Russian armed forces operated around 108 Mi-24s in older versions. At the time of making this video, they lost at least 2 of them. Number 9 is the Saratov landing ship. Saratov entered service in 1966. It was the first of 14 ships of the Project 1171 class that entered service from 1966 to 1975. It was able to land on an unprepared shore with 22 tanks, or 50 armored personnel carriers on board. On top of that, it could carry 313 ready-to-fight soldiers. In addition, Saratov could also serve as a transport ship, and it served in this role when it was known that the Russian landing from the Black Sea would not take place. Saratov was armed with the outdated twin 57mm ZIF-31B gun, introduced in 1956, and the 9K-34 Strela 3 air defense missile system, introduced in the first half of the 1970s. Project 11711 landing ships were supposed to replace the aging Project 1171 landing ships, but due to the fact that the Russians are building them at a snail's pace, so far only 2 out of 4 planned have entered service. Because of that, 3 more old landing ships, Project 1171, not counting the sunken Saratov, are in service. Number 8 is the ZSU-23-4 Shilka. ZSU-23-4 Shilka is a self-propelled anti-aircraft gun intended for the direct protection of ground forces, which entered service with the Soviet Army in 1962. However, its production was commenced in 1964. The production ended in Russia with the introduction of the 2K-22 Tunguska self-propelled anti-aircraft weapon system, which was meant to replace it in 1982. But as you can see, 40 years is not enough to replace the old equipment, so the ZSU-23-4 Shilka and its modernizations are still in service with the Russians. It is armed with quad 23mm guns and has a rate of fire of 3,400 rounds per minute. In addition, the modernized version is also equipped with 4 9K-38 Igwa surface-to-air missiles. Although the 30mm Tunguska cannons have twice the range and almost twice the effectiveness of the 23mm Shilka cannons, so thanks to their insane rate of fire, they are still extremely effective against ground targets. Shilka's disadvantage is the weak armor, which provides only limited protection from the front against small arms fire, and the artillery shell splinters. It has been reported that the sides of this vehicle can be penetrated by standard 7.62 by 39mm rounds. Before the war, Russian armed forces operated around 267 of them. At the time of making this video, they lost at least 4 of them. Number 7 is the BTR-70. Although the BTR-70 was an improvement over the earlier BTR-60, it still has its problems. Among them were poor means of entry and exit for the troops. The BTR-70 incorporates very cramped triangular access doors on both sides of the vehicle. The main weapon system in the turret on the standard BTR-70 is a 14.5mm KPVT machine gun with a basic load of 500 rounds on board. The KPVT can be used against light armored vehicles, soft-skinned vehicles, and infantry behind sandbags or within buildings. There is also a coaxial 7.62mm PKT machine gun with 2,000 rounds also in the turret. At the time of deployment, most Western armored personnel carriers could be engaged. Nowadays, protection against 14.5mm rounds is rather common in mechanized units. Although the BTR-70 has good cross-country capability, high road speed, and large troop carrying capacity, its primary disadvantage is relatively thin armor, only up to 9mm thick. The sloped steel armor protects the crew and infantry from small arms fire and shell splinters. Over the frontal arc, there is protection against 12.7mm rounds. Before the war, the Russian army had no more than 3,000 BTR-70s in various configurations, most of which were in reserve. At the time of making this video, they lost at least one of them. Number 6 is the MT-12. The 100mm MT-12 Rapira smoothbore anti-tank gun, also known as the T-12A, entered service in 1970. It's an improved version of the T-12 anti-tank gun adopted by the Soviet Union in 1961. Despite the Rapira is capable of conducting indirect fire from covered positions at the distance of up to 8 kilometers, its significant disadvantage compared to anti-tank guided missile launchers such as the 9K-135 Cornet, apart from the need to use a vehicle to tow the gun, which is usually the MTLB, is the mass of over 3 tons and dimensions facilitating the detection and destruction of this weapon. In addition, the MT-12 needs a numerous crew of 6 people. It includes the commander, gunner, loader, 1 or 2 ammunition crew, and a driver of the towing vehicle. In turn, the modern anti-tank guided missile launcher can be carried and operated by 2 soldiers. Before the war, the Russians had 2,526 MT-12 guns and their older T-12 versions, of which 2,000 were in reserve. At the time of making this video, they lost at least one of them. Number 5 is the T-64BV. The T-64BV is basically the T-64B with add-on explosive reactive armor. With a mass of 42.5 tons, the engine remained the same as on the T-64B at 700 brake horsepower. It gives very poor power-to-weight ratio, only 16.5 horsepower per ton. It is comparable with the T-34-85. The only advantage of the T-64BV over the T-72A and AV is that the T-64BV's 2A46M1 125mm smoothbore cannon can fire the 9K-112 Cobra anti-tank guided missiles. It can be used to engage armored vehicles at a maximum distance of 4,000 meters and can penetrate around 600 to 700 millimeters of steel armor. However, the T-64 began to become obsolete in the late 80s. Not as much as now, but still. The main Achilles heel is the suspension. It was counted on a vehicle weighing no more than 40 to 45 tons. During development, designers tried to reduce the mass of the tank as much as possible. That's why the T-64 was deprived of the lion's share of the modernization potential. The T-64BV is fitted with the Contact 1 reactive explosive armor, but together with its weak main armor, it offers almost any protection against a modern anti-tank munition. Together with a poor engine and suspension, it's a very obsolete tank by today's standards. Due to the fact that the T-64 tanks are produced only in Ukraine, the Russians, after the collapse of the USSR, were forced to constantly withdraw these machines from service. Before the war, Russian armed forces operated no more than 500 T-64 tanks, the majority of them in reserve. At the time of making this video, they lost at least 16 of them. Number 4 is the T-72AV. Formidable in the mid-1980s, the T-72AV is a coffin on tracks today. The combination of the lack of modern fire control system, a weak engine that provides a power-to-weight ratio at the level of a T-34 tank, or the weak basic armor combined with the first-generation explosive reactive armor Contact 1, which does not protect against modern APF-SDS projectiles or modern anti-tank guided missiles. In addition, while the autoloader in newer Russian tanks have been additionally armored, so after hitting the tank, there is less chance for a spectacular explosion that throws its turret several meters up. In the oldest versions of the T-72, this effect is still easy to achieve. In the West, it's called the Jack-in-the-Box effect. Before the war, the Russian army had no more than 2,500 T-72 in A and AV configurations, most of which were in reserve. At the time of making this video, they lost at least 8 T-72 AV tanks. Number 3 is the T-72A. The T-72A is the base for the T-72AV variant, so they share all the disadvantages. But originally, the T-72A does not have the Contact 1 explosive reactive armor mounted on it. For this reason, Russian soldiers equip it with this armor whenever they can, in order to provide themselves with at least a little better protection. Before the war, the Russian army had no more than 2,500 T-72 in A and AV versions, most of which were in reserve. At the time of making this video, they lost at least 14 T-72A tanks. Number 2 is the BMP-1. The BMP-1 is often viewed as one of the symbols of Soviet military power. At the time of its introduction, it was undoubtedly the best infantry fighting vehicle in the world with its sloped armor, powerful armament, and the ability to cross water obstacles. But by today's standard, it has a couple of major flaws. The troop compartment is very cramped. During the Cold War, NATO tested several captured vehicles. It was found out that only 25% of Western troops found the inside of the vehicle not too cramped, but in winter kit, the number dropped to 15%. This was a major problem, and while the original vehicle could carry 8 men, some armies reduced this number to 6 men in order for the space inside to be more comfortable. The troops exit the BMP-1 by using its rear door. The problem is that the door is hollow and serves as a fuel tank. Many users subsequently never use the door as a fuel tank or even fill it with sand for extra protection. Its other issues are also the inability of the commander to properly see to the right and to the back of the vehicle. After all, it was supposed to go forward, driving the capitalists in front of them instead of fighting retreating battles. Also, BMP-1 has significant shortcomings in its protection scheme. The side, rear, and top armor protected the BMP-1 from small arms fire from most distances, as well as smaller artillery shell fragments, but do not protect the vehicle against 12.7mm heavy machine gun fire from close distances or larger artillery shell fragments. However, in Afghanistan and Chechnya, armor-piercing 7.62 by 54R rounds fired from general-purpose machine guns sometimes penetrated the rear doors and hatches. Because of this, soldiers, even during the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, tend to armor up the sides of the vehicle. On top of that, ammunition is stored near or even inside the fighting compartment, which makes the BMP-1 more vulnerable to enemy anti-tank weaponry. If it gets hit, the ammunition often explodes, killing everyone and destroying the vehicle. The BMP is armed with an archaic 2A 28 73mm smoothbore cannon with poor velocity. Initial production vehicles had a barrel-mounted 9M14 Malutka wire-guided missile launcher with an indifferent performance by today's standard. On many later models, this launcher was completely removed. Since 1979, a BMP-1P was produced. It was fitted with a more advanced Fagot or Konkurs ATGM launcher. The latest Russian version of the BMP-1 is the BMP-1AM. Currently, they have around 20 of them. The BMP-1AM is basically BMP-1 with the original turret replaced by the turret from the BTR-82A with a 2A 72 30mm autocannon. Despite all of its drawbacks, the BMP-1s are still being used to this day. Although the experience from the recent conflict in Ukraine shows they are already obsolete and extremely vulnerable, especially to modern ATGMs and other anti-tank infantry weapons. Before the war, the Russian army had around 7,470 BMP-1s in various configurations. 7,000 of them were in reserve. At the time of making this video, they lost around 42 of them. Number 1 is the guided missile cruiser Moskva. Originally called the Slava, the Moskva was first launched on 27 July 1979 during the Soviet Union era, before being placed into commission on 30 December 1982. It was conceived to destroy U.S. aircraft carriers and had been in service for nearly 4 decades. The ship was built in the city of Mykolaiv, now in Ukraine. It was decommissioned for a refit in 1990 before returning to service in 2000 as the Moskva. In 2020, the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet completed 2.5 months of repairs and maintenance. Despite it, some of its hardware remained completely outdated. The ship's armament included, among others, Basalt and Vulcan anti-ship missiles, as well as S-300 long-range air defense missiles. It also has an automatic dual-barrel 130mm AK-130 cannon and 6 fully automatic 30mm AK-630 close-in weapon systems, but was not equipped with Russia's latest generation Kalibr cruise missiles or hypersonic missiles. It was sunk by 2 Ukrainian R-360 Neptune anti-ship missiles on 14 April 2022. While the loss of the Moskva doesn't rob the Russian Navy of much capability, it is certainly a large blow to its prestige. The Russians haven't lost their flagship since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, when, on 13 April 1904, the battleship Petropavlovsk sank after striking a mine near Port Arthur in northeast China. Interestingly, among the survivors of the battleship's crew was Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich Romanov, a cousin of the then Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II.